case studies on the uses and abuses of history. Before we begin to look at the uses and abuses of history, I just wanted to share with you one of my favorite metaphors of history, and this is by Eugene Weber, a very highly respected historian. And so I won't read this to you, but you can take a look at his metaphor about history is not the one great river into which you can never step twice, flowing from creation to eternity. If similes can escape misrepresentation, it is more like a freeway meandering through time and space. And so he goes on with this metaphor. And I think it's a great metaphor. And I really enjoyed reading your insights this last week on your metaphors of history. Well, for the next several weeks, we are going to be looking at the uses and abuses of history. And so it's kind of fun to see how history is abused by many kinds of people. And so we're going to be looking at what's sometimes referred to as history wars. And history wars is part of a much larger culture wars. And these wars are fought out in the classroom, the museum, and beyond. And some of the big issues in terms of history wars is the function of textbooks and their informing or forming young minds about the nation's past. And I'm not just speaking about the United States, but across the world, this whole question of the purpose of textbooks is a very contentious issue. So consider what the purpose of textbooks are. What was the textbook like that you used in high school, for example? What is the textbook like that you used in college? And think about what the purpose is of history in public schools and how it functions. And also consider, will be in the following week, the function of public history in exhibits, whether in the museum or in the library or any sort of public facility, and how those function. And we will be looking at this in terms of a assignment on museums and memorials, but how public history presents history in terms of its form and its function, because it's also very complicated. And as we'll see, there's tons of controversies, and political agendas get very much sort of hooked into all of these questions of public history and textbooks. And there are many offended constituencies then over these history wars. And what we have seen then with some of the outcomes of these history wars is a past that is sanitized or really stripped of any historical content, because it has been decided in order to not offend constituencies, it's better to then not provide the context. And we'll be seeing some examples of this. But you want to consider how useful and meaningful is the past when it's sanitized and stripped of any kind of real context or meaning. I think the central issue about why history becomes so contentious and so fought over is because it's really about who we are, about our identities, and it matters to us. And I think that's really important and very powerful, that history matters and that it is meaningful to us. And so that, I think, in itself is significant. And even though it's complicated, it's messy, I think that it's wonderful that it matters so much that people are willing to fight over it. So we have a couple of readings, and I also posted some more readings on Blackboard over the issue of textbooks and teaching history. And I really like these articles. They're kind of fun. The article, Picturing the Past, Gender Differences in the Depiction of Historical Figures, is a wonderful look at cultural assumptions and how cultural assumptions that we maybe don't even think about help to shape how we view the past and how we view the world around us. It may seem fairly simple to tell somebody in elementary school to draw a person, but you might have surprising results of what kind of person is drawn. And clearly, the research that was done for this article shows that the past is pictured as a man's world. And how do we move beyond the past being populated by a lot more men than women and go beyond what is sometimes referred to as contributory history into a more holistic total history? In the article, Victims or Victimizers, Museums, Textbooks, Books in the War Debate in Contemporary Japan, combines both the issues of textbooks and museums, and we'll be getting to museums a little later on. But clearly, this article presents a very divided Japan over how to represent World War II, the meaning of war, and there are opposing outlooks on Japanese and seeing the Japanese as victims or aggressors or both. And I think this will be an important sort of counterpoint when we look at how the United States then looked at its actions during World War II, particularly with the Enola Gay controversy. And then there is an article, Stolen History, the Great Texas Textbook War, that was published in a science magazine, Explorations, in 2011, that provides, I think, a pretty good look at what was sort of crazy in Texas. The Texas State Board of Education decided that it would take it upon itself to revamp the history offerings, and so you'll have to read about what was decided there. I guess these big questions are, what kind of history should be taught? And what is the purpose of history? And what kind of history is actually taught? And who decides what kind of history is taught? Who decides what kind of history should be taught? Your textbook readings then will also hopefully get you to start thinking about some other big questions, and then your textbook assignment that we just briefly looked at, you'll see has even more in-depth questions. But first, when you're doing these readings, have this sort of never-ending question: what is the purpose of history in public schools, and who gets to decide? And is it to instill patriotism, citizenship, critical thinking? What do you think the role of history is in public school? And who decides the curriculum? Who do you think should decide the curriculum? And this is very important, as we've seen with previous readings, because who gets to decide the curriculum gets to frame the narrative and tell the story. And so it's very important and very contentious. So whose story is told and for what purpose becomes very much an underlying key element in this question of textbooks and who gets to use what. And where do historians fit into this picture? Do you see many historians active, for example, in the Great Texas Textbook War? What about the students? What do students learn from this process? How do they process this information? What should they learn? And what do they learn? So think about the students, because really that's the key point, isn't it? Then another issue, and I posted some more readings on this, is the whole question of national history standards. You might be aware of this, but in the 1990s, the former head of the NEH, Len V. Cheney, who originally had initiated national history standards, then attacked the national history standards as proposed by Gary Nash's National Center for History in the Schools at UCLA. You can go on to that website and see what kind of work they've done. And Lynn Cheney and others lambasted the efforts by Gary Nash and his committee to create meaningful national history standards as being too revisionist and vilifying the U.S. And so the national history standards got very murky and very ugly, and you can read about that and see how that led to just not only a really ugly scene, but essentially just a stalemate in terms of the history wars. But they're not over. In the 21st century, the idea of national history standards, what should be core classes, have been revived in the Common Core state standards. Also, the No Child Left Behind raises these issues of what students should be learning in history. And one of the very latest you might be familiar with is the Jefferson County Board of Education in Colorado went after the AP Advanced Placement History curriculum, arguing that it was revisionist and unpatriotic. And it's important to keep in mind that the AP History course is an elective course. It's not a required course for students to take, but the Republican National Committee and the Texas State Board of Education, right, we know about them from the other reading, are very critical of the content and the board's position then of seeing the AP history curriculum as unpatriotic and needing to be revised was met with a great deal of protest by teachers, students, and parents. And so what you see in these sort of history wars, particularly in textbooks, is revision being pitted against patriotism, is sort of the language that's used. So what I would like you to think about for this week is for you to first find a interesting article that deals with a textbook in a controversy. And there's textbook controversies in every country in the world. So try to think about, what's the textbook controversies in India or Brazil or South Africa. And when you find your fascinating article on textbook controversy, then consider these questions and then have a lively discussion in a wiki. Consider what the conflicting and competing versions of the historical narrative are, what the various political, ideological, cultural agendas are for the competing narratives, and what is at stake with this textbook controversy, and what it shows us about the use and abuse of history. We will be also addressing these same questions when we look at museums and memorials, because what we will find is that it gets far more complicated when history is out in the public community, in the public arena. And so you want to start thinking about the challenges of teaching history, the challenges of presenting history out in the sort of the public, and the role of the historian within the public arena, and what historians then can do as mediators, as scholars, as experts in terms of history.